Hello, welcome to Block 2, Use of Algebraic Notation, Lesson 2. I'll share my screen. So, in your previous lesson, you learned about single function machines. So, a function machine is you have an input, you have a function, so like a magic box that does something to whatever input you have in, and then you have an output. In today's lesson, we're going to find a way to find the inputs when you're giving the output. Okay, so you'll be given an output and then you'll be asked, what did you put in to get that output? But before we start, I would like you to do this retrieval practice for 4 minutes. Okay, I'll just have a sip of hot chocolate. Okay, we have 2 minutes left. Okay, let's check our answers. So here are the answers. All right, so you can see this is from your previous lesson. So this is a function machine. 78 is the input. the machine is adding 17 to any number that you put in the machine. And then in this case, we put 78, so our answer is 95. And then this one is to divide by 7. This one is to multiply by 4. And then this one you're halving. Okay. And then the last question you've been asked, what do you notice about the calculations in question 2? So multiplying by a half is equivalent to dividing by 2. Okay, you should notice that it's important. We're going to come across a point where we need to use such property or such understanding that multiplying by half is the same as dividing by 2. Okay, let's do some learning. Now, let me ask you, what is the inverse of addition? What is the inverse of addition? Now, in our everyday language, we would say opposite. So don't use opposite. I think we need to start to get into the good habits of maths. So using the right words. So the inverse of addition, I'm sure you would say, is subtraction. What is the inverse of multiplication? The inverse of multiplication is division. Okay, these are really, really important points because we're even going to be using these ideas in the future. Okay, so you really need to know inverse operations. The inverse of squaring is to find the square root. Okay, the inverse of squaring something is to find the square root. And the inverse of halving something, guess what? If you notice, the last question on your retrieval practice is to double. Okay, the inverse of halving is to double. All right. So if I have something like this, where we do not know, remember the title of our lesson is we should be able to find the input when we're given the output. Okay, so we multiplied something by 6. So the machine is multiplying anything you put in by 6, and then it spits out the number on the other side. So we have 48 here. What did we put in? Okay, now this is where our inverse operation comes in. So we need to do the inverse of what we did to the input. Okay, we need to do that inverse operation to the output. So, and that operation, the inverse of multiplying is to divide. So it's just like saying 48 divided by 6, and that gives us 8. Okay, here is this one. Let's do some true false thinking. Is it true that the square root of 3 is 9? Okay, but if we do the inverse operation, we're going to get 3. What about this one? Well, it is true because the square root of 81 is 9. And then if we do the inverse of doing the square root, we're going to have to square 9. And that gives us 81. Okay, I'd like you to have a go at questions 1 to 7. You can pause the video for 10 minutes to do these questions, but I'm going to move on anyway. Okay, so to the solutions, to the answers. But my advice is pause the video for 10 minutes so that you can work through. You can even take longer. Okay, because remember, you're learning to gain mastery, to really understand maths. Okay, and these are really good foundations you're building here. Okay, so this is question 1 to 3. You can pause the video for 5 minutes to do this. But I'm going to reveal the answers anyway. Okay, so make sure you're disciplined. Pause the video, work through the questions before you reveal the answers to mark your work. So here are the answers for question 1 and 2. Okay, this one has to do with the inverse operations that we're talking about. The inverse of addition is subtraction, the inverse of division is multiplication, and the inverse of squaring something is to do the square root of that thing. Okay, and then this one, you're given an input, you just have to do the operation of the function machine, and these are the answers. Okay. Then this one, you asked to explain the method you used to find the inputs. We do inverse operation. So here, if we divided by 10 to get 20, the inverse of dividing is to times by 10. So that's how we got 200. Okay, so this is the answer for question 3. Annie has found the input for the function machine when the input is when the output is 4. So I'll read that again. Annie has found the input for the function machine when the output is 4. Well, the mistake she's done is she hasn't used the inverse. Okay, she should be doing the inverse to get the answer. Okay, so here are the questions for question 4 to question 4 and 5. You can pause the video for I would say you should be able to do this in 3 minutes. You should pause the video for 3 minutes to get this done before you check your answer. But I'm going to reveal the answer anyway. Okay, so be disciplined. Pause the video for 3 minutes. Work through this before you check your answer, because that's how you get better at maths, at learning this concept. So here are the answers. Okay, so here you're given the outputs, you require to find the inputs. Don't forget about inverse operation. So here we're going to be adding. So you do the inverse operation. Okay, here you do the inverse operation, which is 2 times, because instead of dividing by 9, you multiply to get the input. Okay, so these are the answers. And then here, question 5, you're asked to find the input for these function machines if the output for each of them is 400. Okay, so you're given the output, and then you have to do the inverse operation. Here are the questions for questions 6 to 7. Again, you can pause this for 3 minutes and then get this done. But I'm going to reveal the answers anyway. So for question 6, you're told find the input for these function machines if the output to each of them is 78.2. Okay, so remember, you do your inverse operations to find the input. Okay, so here are the answers. Okay, so for this one, going that way, we're doing the square root. So going that way, we need to square it. Here, we're multiplying by 2. Going that way, you need to divide by 2. Okay. All right. We'll move on to some new learning. So if I have this, if I put 10 into this function machine and I have 5 on the other side, what is the inverse operation? Because here it's obvious that I would have divided that by 2, halving. So the inverse of halving is to double. If you remember that, I did mention one of the inverse operation, that the inverse of halving is to double. So multiplying by half is equivalent to dividing by 2. Okay. So this is like dividing by 2. So the inverse of that should be to double, which is 2 times by 2. Okay. If I ask you to write an operation to complete the function machine so that the input is between 20 and 30, how many can you find? Yeah. We need to write an operation to complete. So we can do the first one. We can say, well, Okay. I'm sure you've had a think for about 10 seconds. You can pause and have a think, but I'm going to continue anyway. So we do the reverse operation. Okay, we can say, okay, 18 subtract 3 subtract 7. Okay, if the function machine is any of these, we can do the reverse operation to find out an input between 20 and 30. So for example, if the input was 20, okay, or if the input was 20, we can say 20 minus 3. That will not give us 18. But remember, the inputs can be between 20 and 30. So it can be 21 minus 3. Okay, so it can be any of those. All right. Okay, have a go at the rest of the questions. That's question 8 and 9. Okay, I'm sure you will pause the video and work through the questions. I'll give you about 4 minutes to do that, but I'm going to carry on anyway. So make sure you're disciplined, pause the video, work through the questions before you check your answers. Okay, so here you're asked to complete the function machine. What could you have multiplied 4 by to get that? So here are the answers. You see, okay, for question 8. So you multiply by 4 to get 16. You must have divided by 4 here to get 1. So it's the same thing. Divided by a quarter to get 16. Now I am going to have to explain this, but just give me a minute. And then this one, you add 12 to get 16. And then here is 4. 2 negatives will give you a positive. Okay. So 2 negatives, you need to start learning some new concepts. So these 2 negatives next to each other, is a positive. So that's why that is 16. Now, to divide, so if you're dividing 4 by a quarter, imagine 4 boxes. Now, to divide means splitting things up so that they have equal parts. Okay, so it means you're dividing each of these boxes into a quarter. Yeah, each part should be a quarter. Each part should be a quarter. Now, if you do that, in the end, you have 16 quarters. That's what this 16 means. Okay, so if you do that, you have 4 lots of 4 quarters. And that's 16. So it's really important you understand that. Okay. Let's drop that off. Okay. This is for question 9. So this is the answer for question 9. I'm sure you've done your work. You're now checking your answers. So here is you're told to write different operations to complete the function machines using the given inputs. So just different operations trying to, to check the function machines to give different outputs. You can have many different examples as much as you can. Okay, having a practice with your numbers. Okay, using your number skills which you would have learned in primary school. Okay, or in any year you have been. Okay. Okay, so this brings us to the end of our lesson. So what have we learned so far? In this lesson, we have learned that you can use inverse operations to find the input when an output is given to you for a function machine. Now, it's not only function machine we're going to be using this skill, but you need to know that we use inverse operations. And some of the inverse operations we've learned are: one, inverse of adding is to subtract. Inverse of subtracting is to add. Inverse of multiplying is to divide. Inverse of dividing is to multiply. Inverse of halving is to double, or inverse of dividing by 2, which is the same thing as halving, is to times by 2. Okay. Inverse of squaring is to do the square root, or inverse of square root is to do squaring. Okay, so these are some of the things we've learned in this lesson, and it's really important as we move on in block 2 of using algebraic notation. Okay, until next time, bye now, take care.